Hi and Assalamualaikum. We from Group 8. We want to present about the Cory cycle. So now we want to start with the introduction of the Cory cycle. The Cory cycle or glucose lactate cycle was discovered by Carl Ferdinand Cory and Gertie Teresa Redney, a husband and wife team, in the 30 and 40 series of the last century. They demonstrated the existence of the metabolic cooperation between the skeletal muscles working under low oxygen condition and the liver. This cycle can be summarized as follows. First, the conversion of glucose to lactic acid or lactate by anaerobic glycolysis in skeletal muscle cells. Second, the diffusion of lactate from muscle cell into the bloodstream by which it is transported to the liver. Third, the conversion of lactate to glucose by hepatic gluconeogenesis. Last one is the diffusion of glucose from the hepatocytes into the bloodstream by which is transported back to the skeletal muscle cells, thereby closing the cycle. Where does the Cory cycle occur? In addition to skeletal muscles, this metabolic cooperation was also demonstrated between other extrahepatic tissues and liver. Indeed, at the glucose-alanine cycle, the glucose-lactate cycle is active between the liver and all those tissues that do not completely oxidize glucose to CO2 and H2O, in which case pyruvate the conversion to lactate or by transformation to alanine would lack. In addition to skeletal muscle cells, examples of cells that continually produce lactic acids are red blood cells, immune cells in the lymph nodules, proliferating cells in the bone marrow, and epithelial cells in the skin. Notice that skeletal muscles produce lactate even at rest, although at low rate.
Hi, my name is Nurul Natasha. I'm going to tell you about the process of Cory cycle. So, in muscular activity requires ATP, which is provided by the breakdown of glycogen in skeletal muscle. The breakdown of glycogen known as glycogenolysis, which is stored in the skeletal muscle by releasing the glucose. During muscular activity, the stock of ATP needs to be constantly replenished. When the supply of oxygen is sufficient, the energy comes from feeding pyruvate, one product of glycolysis, into citric acid cycle, which ultimately generates ATP through oxygen-dependent oxidative phosphorylation. But during an intense muscular activity, the oxygen supply is insufficient, so energy must be released through anaerobic metabolism. The process is known as lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation converts pyruvate to lactate by lactate dehydrogenase. Most importantly, fermentation regenerates NAD positive by maintaining its concentration, so additional glycolysis reaction can occur. The fermentation can oxidize the NADH produced by glycolysis back to NAD positive, transferring 2 electrons from NADH to reduce pyruvate into lactate. Lactate produced by anaerobic fermentation can be transported to the liver. In the liver, gluconeogenesis can occur. From an intuitive perspective, gluconeogenesis reverses both glycolysis and fermentation by converting lactate first into pyruvate and then back into glucose. The glucose is then supplied into the muscle through bloodstream. It is ready to be fed into further glycolysis reactions. If muscle activity has stopped, the glucose is used to replenish the supply of glycogen through glycogenesis. The glycolysis step of cycle produces 2 ATP molecules at a cost of 6 ATP molecules that consume in the gluconeogenesis steps. The cycle must be maintained by the net consumption of 4 ATP molecules. As a result, the cycle cannot be sustained indefinitely. The intensive consumption of ATP molecules in the Cory cycle shift the metabolic burden from the muscle to the liver.
Cory cycle is an important metabolic process to help our body produce additional energy required by the body when performing a vigorous activity. Cory cycle also helps in preventing of acid accumulation in muscle. It will transfer as lactic acid from the muscle to the liver and produce glucose that act as energy. The advantages of Cory cycle is it will produce energy when the oxygen decreases. When we do vigorous activity, the amount of oxygen intake decreasing. Since the oxygen is insufficient, the glucose will be broken down through an aerobic metabolism to produce energy to the body. Other than that, Cory cycle also increases metabolism in our body. If a vigorous activity continues, the body adopts an alternate metabolic route to get rid of lactate and keeps producing energy and aerobically. The disadvantages of Cory cycle, it will give bad effect to the liver and kidney. This is because the red blood cell will depend in the anaerobic catalysis of ATP production that will happen in the liver if the activity is too extreme. The energy requirement will exceed the capacity of the cycle to generate glucose from lactate, which result of the excess lactic acid in the system that can lead to the tissue damage, cramp, hyperventilation, and more.
Summary for the Cory cycle. Cory cycle is referred to metabolic pathway where lactate produced by anaerobic glycolysis in a muscle move. First discovered, this cycle is called and also gravity Cory. So that's why the name this cycle is Cory cycle. Glucose is breakdown to the lactate. Lactate carried from skeletal muscle through blood and through liver. In the liver, it oxidizes it to pyruvate. Pyruvate produced to glucose by gluconeogenesis. When we're doing some exercise, the energy is required, so this will lead to increases of level of glycolysis. The importance of this cycle is to demonstrate the fact where 40% of plasma glucose turn over, and then it also produces ATP, where that is the energy source for the muscle activities. That's all from our group. Thank you for hearing.